Please note that the Burn It Nutrition podcast is for educational purposes only and is not meant to substitute for the advice of a doctor. Please consult your GP before using any of the techniques or products discussed on this show. Hope you like it.
Welcome to episode 24 and our very own Halloween-themed version of the Burn It Nutrition podcast. I am your host, Joseph Navarro. In today's show, we are going to discover of the monster your mother should have warned you about. That's right, today we are going to hear a scary story. After all, the night of All Hallows Eve quickly approaches. And yes, we will also be challenging your courage, testing if you're brave enough to discover of the very real monster that is among us. You see, today, we will be placing the spotlight on glyphosate, a lethal chemical that is sprayed all over the breakfast cereals many mothers fed their children this very morning. A lethal chemical that is being used to grow our food supplies that is showing to have some horrifying effects. So sit back, grab your teddy bear, and be sure to leave the lights on. And brace yourself, because you may not be ready to hear what I'm about to tell you. You see, this episode will challenge you to understand the aftermath of this chemical called glyphosate, to learn the science on how it ravages us from the inside out, and how it's even being discovered within the breast milk of pregnant mothers across the country. And in order for us to better understand the way this beast is spreading, we will hear from the senior researcher at MIT, and that is the very own Dr. Stehpanie Seneff, one of the most brilliant minds in this field. She will help break down the science so we can get a glimpse of the gravity of this mutant creations called GMOs that can be leading to the rapid increase in diseases all over the country. And just so you know, it may be alarming to hear what is going on in our food supply, and you may be surprised on how evil some can truly be. So again, make sure the door is locked and the lights are still on. Are you scared? Well, you should be, because this is the Halloween-themed episode of the Burn It Nutrition podcast. But first, let's hear from our sponsors. You know, there is a lot of confusion on how to effectively apply a ketogenic diet. There's just so much conflicting information. This is something I struggled with when I first started my transformation. Well, after diving into the science, I was able to drop 60 pounds of pure fat in 7 months. And in the process, I learned so much that I knew I had to tell the world. So I created 5th Stage Keto. I put everything I learned through my own journey to health into my audiobook, giving you what is needed to see the biggest changes in body composition and finally reach your goals. And 5th Stage Keto is an audiobook that also includes the ebook, so you can see the workouts included both for the gym and for home workouts. Plus recipes to some of our favorite comfort foods like keto bacon pepperoni pizza and garlic chicken with lemon zucchini noodles. Insanely good. Just head over to burnitnutrition.com to get yours. And don't forget to use the coupon code BURNIT for a bonus $5 off. Again, that is burnitnutrition.com. Also, if you want to help support this show, then you can do this by becoming a Burn It Patreon member. This will allow us to keep this show on air. And you even get a copy of 5th Stage Keto when you sign up as a Burn It member. So head to patreon.com/burnit and help support the show you love. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Facebook under Burn It Nutrition to check out some of my before and after pictures. They are pretty shocking. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. I try to make fitness and nutrition fun and entertaining to listen to, so subscribe so you don't miss another show. You can find the links to these announcements on the show notes of this episode. How about we get this show started? A show that may push you outside of your comfort zone. Are you up for the challenge? Let's find out.
Burn it. You are not alone as you begin this new stage of life. Learn the strategic methods to reach your goals and flourish the light within. With our guidance, you will uncover the hidden truths that have been missing from your understanding. It's time to let it burn.
I once heard a story of a young couple in love with their whole lives ahead of them. Making the most of their time together, they made an effort to spend more time exploring in search of adventure and memories. But on this day, their search for adventure took a different turn. The story goes that they were on their first road trip together en route outside of the state. They were driving up the coast towards a bed and breakfast. As they made their way up, they made several stops, taking every opportunity to take more pictures to share with their loved ones. While the light the sun provided was beginning to fade, these frequent stops allowed the night to catch up with them. And so they found themselves driving deep into the night on an unfamiliar highway that began to take twists and turns as they drove into the mountains. This made them extra cautious as the visibility lessened. You see, it was the middle of October, and the nights began to get colder. And as they made their way through the narrow curves of the road, they spotted what looked to be a hitchhiker with a pale white hand stretched out, requesting to be picked up. As they approached, they saw it was a female, a young girl actually, all alone in a thin white dress. But her face was not clear. Something seemed off. As they passed her, with her hand stretched out in need of help, the young man driving nervously said, "Well, good luck getting picked up this late into the night." But his girlfriend had an odd feeling, and she turned to him and suddenly said, "We have to turn around. She's all alone, and she must be freezing. Please, I think we should help. She needs help." This was something he was hoping she wouldn't say. But he slowed the car down, pulled to the side, and made a U-turn. Driving back, they approached this lonely hitchhiker. As they pulled up to her, they noticed her white dress was dirty with some tears. They also noticed her face. It seemed just as pale as her hands, and she had this worried stare that wouldn't go away. The young couple were startled, but still they said, "Is everything okay? Do you need a ride?" The pale-faced young girl responded in the sweetest and gentle voice.
"Oh yes, please. I need to get home. My parents must be very worried."
The couple looked at each other, then looked back saying, Okay, we can help. Where do you live?"
"Not far at all. Just down the road, about 15.3 miles from that broken tree. In a cute little white house across from the corner gas station."
And so she stepped inside, buckled her seatbelt, and they drove off towards her home. The young couple tried to make conversation, but their pale-faced hitchhiker became silent and looked to be falling asleep. And so they kept driving, and as they went, they noticed a gas station up ahead, and what looked to have an old and broken down white house right across from it. Verifying to see if this was the house, they looked back to ask the young girl, and were frightened and horrified to see that she was gone. No trace of her. The only thing she left behind was the buckled seatbelt. In shock and frightened, they pulled into the old white house. Still confused on what had just occurred, the beams from their headlights shined into the windows of the old wooden house. And out of the window, they saw a face looking back at them. An old man that came out to see what was going on. He stepped off his porch, walking towards the car. "Can I help you?" As he asked this question, a look on his face seemed like he didn't want to hear the answer. The young couple in the car responded quickly. "I think this is a mistake. We have been driving all night, and well, we must be tired, but we were driving a few miles back and picked up a young girl who needed a ride." The old man cut them off and said, "Let me ask you, was it about 15.3 miles back? And did this girl ask you to bring her here?" The young couple were stunned and responded, "Yes, how did you know?" But she's not here anymore." "That's right, she's gone," said the old man. "You didn't imagine this, and you're not the first. The person, or should I say, the spirit you picked up, was my daughter. She was killed by a hit-and-run driver 40 years ago. They never found the person who did it, so it seems her spirit keeps searching for closure. I am sorry this frightened you. Would you like to come in?" The young couple's shock and adrenaline began to fade. They began to grasp that they just encountered a spirit from another realm. Frightened, they said no thank you, pulling away and speeding off, making the conclusion that they will think twice before picking up any lonely hitchhikers on a dark road deep into the night. Well, that was a different way to start the show. Are you scared yet? Not yet? Well, we're just getting started. You see, this is the Halloween-themed episode of the Burn It Nutrition podcast. Now, I'm sure most of us have been around the campfire, telling scary stories while drinking some hot chocolate or roasting some marshmallows. I'm sure we've all heard the scary stories of laying in bed with your feet dangling outside the covers to suddenly feel a cold hand grab your feet. Or the story of a man who heard his wife complaining that she couldn't sleep and crawled into bed with him, only to wake up the next morning cold and shivering, holding the dress she was buried in. Are you getting scared now? Well, you're not alone. You see, throughout history, every culture has had these stories that frighten many. Going back to 4000 BC, the Sumerian and Babylonian people told stories of the legend of the Ikimu, a spirit that, if not buried correctly, would return to drain the life from the living. Even the ancient Egyptians had their versions of vampire legends. The legend found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead said that if the spirit of Ka didn't receive offerings, that it would leave its tomb in search of blood to drink. Gross, I know. Even as early as the 16th century, during the time of widespread death from plagues, another mythical story was told. A story that told of vampires that fed off the bodies of the victims of these plagues. And these fears were widespread, so much so that anyone suspected of being a vampire were buried with rocks tightly wedged inside their mouths. These campfire stories may be frightening and send goosebumps throughout your skin, but that's just all they are. They're just stories. But what I'm about to tell you today, in this episode, is not a made-up story to scare children around the campfire. No. This that I'm about to tell you is the reality that you and I live in. I'm going to tell you about the real monster that doesn't just show his ugly face in the darkness of the night. No, this monster is there, even when the brightness of daylight is shining. This that I'm about to tell you is what your mother should have warned you about. The more I dove into the research, the more this real-life scary story turned into a monster, a beast that was bigger than I imagined. You see, today, we are placing the spotlight on the toxic chemicals and pesticides used to grow the food that feeds you and your children. We will discover how toxins used in GMOs can be leading to the widespread diseases all over the country. We will learn how the largest chemical corporations have taken control of your food and lobby the government to make it easier for them to make billions with little regard to your health. To do this, we will dive into the science of the most widely used pesticide called glyphosate and its toxic effects to discover what it is actually doing at a biological level. For this, we will bring in one of the most brilliant minds in this field to help us understand the science. That's right, later, we will have the pleasure of hearing from the senior researcher at MIT, and that is Dr. Stehpanie Seneff. Her knowledge of computer science and human biology has allowed her to use formulas to find correlations between these toxic chemicals and the rise of serious diseases like autism that would normally be too complicated to uncover. In a way, her use of computer science has made her into a real-life Sherlock Holmes, allowing her and her colleagues to connect the dots, making them into real-life heroes to battle this very real monster our generation is facing. You see, understanding the science of these toxins that are used all over the country, which seep into the water supply and even get taken up into the air, is very important. You see, being aware of the dangers and diseases they can cause will help you fight back. Remember that awareness is the very first step to fight back against these toxins that may be inside you at this very moment. Are you scared now? Because you should be, because this is a true story. To learn more about the real monsters that are among us, we need to go back in time, all the way back to the dawn of agriculture. Going back to the very first farmers, we can see that they had several obstacles to overcome. And well, many of the obstacles were out of their control. Things like long periods without a single drop of rain. You see, controlling the weather was just not an option. Another issue that had to be addressed was the problem of pests and insects, as well as weeds. You see, throughout history, the farmer was always fighting off the damage weeds had on his crops. That's right, weeds aren't just an ugly-looking plant. No, to a farmer, they are much more sinister. Why? Well, let me explain. You see, to a farmer, the crops he is growing, whether that is wheat, corn, cotton, strawberries, whatever it may be, that is his livelihood. These crops that he labors on will provide the means to feed his family and produce an income. But farming isn't as simple as just planting a seed and making sure to water it. Not when you have massive fields to tend to. And one of the biggest obstacles farmers have are weeds. You see, weeds steal much needed water, nutrients, and sunlight from the crops that the farmer is wanting to grow. Ideally, we want limited resources like water and nutrients in the soil to go to their intended targets, which is the edible and profitable crops that are being grown. And well, the problem of dealing with weeds has led to the creation of a monster. It has led to the creation of toxic chemicals that are showing to be a possible cause to some of the widespread diseases we are seeing today. You see, when we take a closer look, it seems that cancer, autism, allergies all lead back to the use of toxic chemicals in our food supply. Toxins that are leading to ever-increasing rates of chronic diseases and even early death. In a way, the need to solve the issue of weeds on the farmlands have triggered our own modern version of a plague. Except this plague is a slow and silent killer that happens to be very profitable for a select group of people. So, it's time we learn more about the very real monster you and even your children will most likely encounter today. It's time we learn what this monster is, how it functions, and what it is capable of. This way we learn how to avoid it, and more importantly, learn how to fight back, so that our future generations don't have to live in fear and worry about the foods they feed their children. It's time we dive into the science and history of this monster that are genetically modified organisms, also called GMOs. The decline of the health of our nation should alarm you. This trend of ever-growing rates of diseases is not normal. In other episodes, we already covered that one of the main factors of this decline in our nation's health began in the 1970s. Along the same time, we changed our dietary guidelines, demonizing dietary fats and increasing the recommendations towards a higher carb diet. And well, interestingly enough, this is also along the same timeline that introduced the use of toxic herbicides that had previously never been used in our food supply. And well, maybe they too played a role in the increasing rates of diseases. In this episode, I want to share what I've learned in hopes of bringing awareness of this very important issue that is showing to be truly sinister. So, let's begin. Now, what exactly are GMOs? Well, GMOs are defined as genetically modified organisms, which are designed by scientists in a lab, taking genes from the DNA of one species and then artificially implanting these genes into totally different plants or animal species. These foreign genes can be taken from many different sources. Some genes are taken from viruses or bacteria, or even genes from animals or humans, all in efforts to bring a desired and, unnatural new type of species. This exchange and transfer of genes has many different names. It can be called transgenic organisms, genetic engineering, GE, or the most well-known term called genetic modifications, GM, or GMO, genetically modified organisms. Now, it's important to understand that this is very different than the traditional breeding that has been done for thousands of years. You see, for centuries, farmers have used selective breeding by cross-pollinating two different but similar plants. This process was done over a long period of time, usually around 6 to 10 generations, that would result in a new plant with improved traits, bringing strong and plentiful harvests. But this took time, which is the way nature works. Nature is not rushing things in efforts to bring products to the market to increase profits. No, nature has no timeline. And throughout history, we have also used crossbreeding to make upgraded versions of animals. This was done by mixing two different breeds of dogs to create a new mix of genes. For example, breeders designed border collies by choosing specific traits that would help their dogs to be expert herders. But this is not the same as what scientists are doing to GMOs in the lab. You see, they are taking genes from two completely different species that would never be able to breed in nature, and are artificially combining the genes of these two completely different organisms, which again, doesn't sound like a good idea. You see, nature doesn't allow this, so what makes us think we should? When this does happen to occur in nature, for example, when a horse breeds with a donkey, then you get a mule. And since these two different species have different number of chromosomes, the horse having 64 and the donkey 62, usually prevents from them pairing up correctly, thus leaving most mules infertile. In a way, this is nature's method of halting any unnatural crossbreeding to continue on. But apparently, certain scientists and the companies that fund them think they can play God and bypass this without seeing any negative consequences. This is why some say GMO should stand for God move over, since this is humans thinking they can do better. Well, let's go deeper into this rabbit hole and see exactly why this may be a bad idea. So what makes GMOs so sinister? Why are they so dangerous? Well, you see, this process of combining genes in a lab doesn't come without possible side effects. Yes, genetically modifying a plant to provide higher nutrient values would seem like a great idea, but the sad reality is that the majority of GMOs are not designed to achieve this goal. No, most GMOs are made to either be able to tolerate and survive certain herbicides, or they are given the ability to produce their own pesticides, which neither provide any health improvements on the consumer, but they do bring on increased profits to the makers of these herbicides and GMO crops. Learning of this really bothered me, and it shouldn't sit well with you either. Now, the combining of GMOs with herbicides as a combo is where this monster begins to show its disastrous effects on our health. You see, the majority of GMOs are made to withstand a particular herbicide. The most common of these is called Roundup, which has the active ingredient called glyphosate. Again, remember this word because glyphosate is the name of the very real monster we are facing today. Again, GMO crops like corn, soy, and canola are designed to survive the toxic effects of glyphosate. This allows farmers to spray their entire fields with this toxic chemical without harming these crops, but it does kill every other plant that it comes in contact with, helping solve the issue of weeds for farmers. Before this addition of GMO crops, which are seeds that are designed ready to withstand this toxic chemical, well, before these seeds were used, farmers needed to hire lots of help to manually remove the weeds by hand, or by spraying just the weeds with these herbicides, but avoiding the good crops, which was labor intensive. Well, now, with these GMO crops, they can just take a plane or tractor and spray the entire field, since their seeds have been altered to survive this herbicide. This sounds great, right? Well, if we look under the microscope, we will find that this isn't the simple fix they want us to believe. You see, GMO seeds are not a result of natural cross-pollination. No, sir. These require high-tech labs using methods like gene splicing to genetically alter the seeds, thus introducing the genes from two completely different species that would never be able to reproduce naturally, all in efforts to provide herbicide-resistant crops, reducing labor and increasing profits. Now, one of the issues that arises over time is that weeds sprayed with these toxins build up a tolerance, and thus they develop into super weeds, making them that much harder to kill, and thus needing even more toxic chemicals to be sprayed. This leads to even more serious issues. One is on the effects on our environment. You see, often, the spraying of these fields isn't very accurate. Remember, wind has a mind of its own, and it can blow this toxic chemical, spreading their dangerous effects to anything it comes in contact with. In Hawaii, this is starting to become a real concern, since that is where much of the toxic formulas are first tested. And well, these fields happen to be next to schools where young children are at play. And another issue of the effects of these toxins is spillage into our water supply, which affects the fish and aquatic life, and even seeping into our drinking water. Does that sound refreshing? I don't think so. And other GMOs like Bt cotton, which are engineered by implanting a bacteria known as Bacillus thuringiensis within the crop to produce their own pesticides. That's right, there are GMOs designed to produce their own poison. And when any insects eat these crops, then they will also be ingesting the poison itself, since it is part of every cell of this GMO crop, making it toxic to the insects. You see, when they ingest this GMO crop, their insides begin to develop holes and spores that eventually kill the insect. This method is also used in corn, called Bt corn, that can be fed to cattle, chickens, or humans. And if that's what it does to an insect, imagine what it can do to you. In India, certain farmers allowed their sheep to graze on this Bt cotton plants after the harvest. And guess what? Thousands got sick and even died. This is the monster we're dealing with. This is the real danger we face. This is not just a scary story, but in actuality, it can be the reason why we are seeing such widespread sickness and disease all over the country. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's normal that the US spends more on healthcare than Japan, France, China, Canada, Italy, Brazil, Spain, Australia, and the UK combined? Is that normal? That's right. We are so sick that we spend more money on healthcare than all these huge countries combined. That is not right. That is not the way it should be. Let me ask you, why is it that the US only makes up 5% of the world's population, yet we are fed over 50% of the world's pharmaceutical drugs? More sick people, more selling them drugs. Well, something else to wrap your brain around is that the US also consumes the most glyphosate. Yeah, you heard that right. We consume up to 25% of all the glyphosate. How is this possible? Well, from what I've read, it seems that the government agencies entrusted to keep you safe have chosen to look the other way. Instead of making it harder for the corporations making these toxic chemicals, they instead seem to have facilitated the use of them. Yes, this very real monster is dangerous, and worst off is that it's everywhere. It's in our crops, it's in our water supply, and it's even in the air. And yes, you better believe it, it's in our food. Meaning, it's probably inside of you. Well, let's now go deeper into the science. Let's learn how glyphosate affects our health to better understand this monster in hopes of fighting back. But first, a break to hear from our sponsors. Now, one of the hardest parts of eating organic and GMO-free is searching the grocery store for foods that have actually been verified as GMO-free. Well, now this is no longer a problem, thanks to Thrive Market. That's right, Thrive Market is an online store that makes it easy to get everything you need in one place. That's right, whether you are paleo, low carb, gluten-free, vegan, or feeding the whole family, Thrive Market has you covered, all free of GMOs and delivered conveniently to your doorstep with free shipping in the USA. So head over to thrivemarket.com/burnit and get a free 1-month trial, as well as 25% off your first order, plus their free shipping. Pretty cool, right? Again, that is thrivemarket.com/burnit. Now, let's get back to the show. So now that we have uncovered the monster that are GMOs, and now that we have discovered what seems like an irresponsible and untested science experiment done on our food supply, we can go further into the weeds. It's time to learn some of the science on how these toxic chemicals like glyphosate affect our bodies. So get ready to feed your brain the knowledge it desires. Now, going back many decades to the year 1974, a company named Monsanto has just launched their new flagship product called Roundup. This is an herbicide that used the lethal chemical glyphosate as its main active ingredient. This herbicide was new, but over time grew to be the most widely used herbicide all over the world, being used by farmers to even everyday consumers, spraying it freely all over their yards. And now it is used more than any other herbicide. Over 250 million pounds of this is sprayed every year. Well, when Monsanto first looked into selling this herbicide, they made the claim that it was safe and caused no harm to humans. They explained that it was harmless to humans because it only hindered the process in plants called the shikimate pathway. Their claim was that this shikimate pathway was only present in plants and certain bacteria, and thus it wouldn't harm humans since we don't have this pathway. But this wasn't entirely correct. Let me explain. Yes, while the human cells don't have the shikimate pathway, the trillions of bacteria we have in our gut microbiome do have this pathway. Remember, we have a huge diversity of bacteria in our gut called our microbiome. In actuality, we have more bacteria in our gut than we do cells in our body. So in a way, we are more bacteria than human. And these bacteria in our gut play a huge role in our overall health. They have important jobs, but when chemicals like glyphosate are ingested, will hinder their ability to do their job, leading to many health issues. So this claim that Monsanto made, stating that glyphosate causes no harm to humans, was inaccurate. The evidence seems to show that it does have negative health implications. They may not be immediate, but they do occur. You see, the damage and disease come on gradually over a long period of time with chronic exposure. A true silent monster that keeps beating you down day after day until you're left weak, sick, or dead. Now, to be fair, many scientists in the 1970s didn't fully understand the importance of a gut microbiome. This is research that scientists are recently starting to better understand. This is also why more testing should have been done before it went out to the public. But again, just to restate, Monsanto's claim that glyphosate, the active ingredient in their Roundup, was safe because it blocked the shikimate pathway, which they claimed was only present in plants and certain bacteria. But what they didn't realize is that the human gut is full of good bacteria that does have this shikimate pathway. So, when we realize that our gut bacteria plays a huge role in how our body works, we can see why a chemical that blocks the ability of the good bacteria in our gut to do their job is such a big problem. You see, the good bacteria in our gut have key roles in the production of essential aromatic amino acids, known as tyrosine, tryptophan, and phenylalanine. These are crucial to our health, and they are produced by our gut bacteria using this shikimate pathway. Well, when this process is blocked by the villain in our story called glyphosate, then we develop deficiencies. You see, these essential aromatic amino acids are precursors to some of the most important compounds in our bodies. Biologically active molecules like thyroid hormone, CoQ10, vitamin K, vitamin E, melatonin, folate, as well as dopamine and serotonin, both of which play a huge role in our mental health, anxiety, and depression. Serotonin also plays a factor in our feelings of hunger and the regulation of our blood sugar. When these are not working properly, can lead to issues like type 2 diabetes, issues with weight, and possible battles with Parkinson's. And it gets worse. You see, glyphosate was first patented as a broad-spectrum chelator, meaning it's a chelating agent. You may be asking, what is a chelating agent? Well, let me explain. So chelating agents are substances that cling on to and sequester metal ions, making them unavailable for chemical reactions within the surrounding materials. In other words, chelating agents cage in key minerals like iron and manganese, blocking the body's ability to use them. This is actually the way glyphosate kills weeds. It binds key nutrients that leave the weed plants weak and sick, causing them to die. And so crops that are sprayed with Roundup, which contain the main ingredient glyphosate, can leave the crops and the soil they are grown in deficient in nutrients. Very important to understand that these crops absorb these chemicals, and when they are fed to animals as GMO feed, then that same chelation process can take effect, leaving the animals with nutrient deficiencies. And going further down the line, when humans eat GMO crops or animals that were fed GMO feed, then we too can be ingesting these mineral deficient foods, or even ingesting the chelating agents themselves, leaving us with nutrient deficiencies. This could be why many go into their doctors and run blood work that show a large array of mineral deficiencies. And it seems that this can be a direct correlation with the consumption of foods that contain glyphosate. That hinders our body's ability to convert the bioavailable forms of these very important nutrients. And this will not end well. There have been few topics that I have researched that have disturbed me as much as this one. And as I dove deeper into the ways this toxic chemical is used, I began to get more and more frustrated. And one of those findings was when I learned that glyphosate is sprayed on crops like wheat just a few days prior to being harvested. That's right, this wheat herbicide is now being used as a desiccant, meaning it is sprayed on crops like wheats, oats, cane sugar, and others as a way to dry the crop so that it's faster to harvest and easier to store. This is a method many farmers use right before the crop goes out to be used to make all the processed foods feeding millions of Americans. Things like breads, crackers, cookies, breakfast cereals, and much more. Yup, it's scary to realize that millions of moms are starting their children's mornings with a fresh bowl of cereal that was sprayed with this toxic herbicide just days before it was harvested. If I had children, then hearing of this would anger me. And this method of pre-harvest spraying of herbicides like glyphosate can give us a clue to the sharp rise in gluten intolerance. That's right, glyphosate seems to be a likely cause of all the gluten and celiac issues many are facing. How? Well, let me explain. So, unless you have been living under a rock, you have probably seen all the gluten-free marketing. Well, that is because more and more people are having issues with gluten. So companies are doing their best to remove it from their products. But the reality is that gluten, a protein found in wheat and other grains that helps the dough rise and give it its chewy texture, has been in wheat and grains for ages, ever since it was first used. But only until recently have more and more people began to complain of being unable to consume it without digestive issues. And well, pre-harvest glyphosate spraying could be why we are seeing these spikes in gluten intolerance. Sure, there are those smaller groups of people who are just born with sensitivities, but for the majority of those dealing with gluten intolerance, glyphosate may be the culprit. One of the top researchers in this field, Dr. Stehpanie Seneff, which we will hear from later in the show, has published a paper that helps us see the connections between celiac disease and the use of glyphosate as a desiccant. In her paper, published in the Journal of Disciplinary Toxicology, goes on to say, celiac disease is associated with imbalances in gut bacteria that can be fully explained by the known effects of glyphosate on gut bacteria. Characteristics of celiac disease point to impairment in many cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are involved with detoxifying environmental toxins, activating vitamin D3, catabolizing vitamin A, and maintaining bile acid production, as well as sulfate supplies to the gut. She goes on to say that deficiencies in iron, cobalt, copper, and other rare metals associated with celiac disease can be attributed to glyphosate's strong ability to chelate these elements. Deficiencies in tryptophan, tyrosine, methionine, and selenomethionine associated with celiac disease match glyphosate's known depletion of these amino acids. Celiac disease patients have increased risk to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which has also been implicated in glyphosate exposure, and reproductive issues associated with celiac disease, such as infertility, miscarriages, and birth defects, can also be explained by glyphosate. Glyphosate residue in wheat and other crops are likely increasing recently due to the growing practice of crop desiccation just prior to harvest. I know that was a little complicated, but I placed a link to this study on the show notes at burnitnutrition.com. That way you can go back and take a look at it. In the study, you can clearly see on Figure 1 a graph showing the sharp rise in cases of celiac disease that match up with the sharp increase in use of this toxic chemical that is glyphosate. So the evidence is mounting, and Monsanto, one of the biggest producers of this herbicide that use this toxic chemical, are starting to feel the pressure. So it's about time we place the spotlight on Monsanto, a company that have been ranked over and over as one of the most evil companies in the world. So far, we have covered some of the very real dangers that can come from the consumption of toxic chemicals. Chemicals like glyphosate that are used in herbicides like Roundup. But now it's time to set this monster aside, to learn of the company that started it all. It's time to hear of the history of the Monsanto Corporation to better understand the gravity of their creations. Now, the reason this company keeps showing up on the lists ranking the most evil companies in the world year after year is, well, for good reason. You see, Monsanto have been the producers of some of the most toxic chemicals to be used on our planet. Yes, this chemical company has a long and disturbing history. A chemical company that is now in control of a large part of the world's food supply. Well, let's place the spotlight on Monsanto and get a better understanding on why they're considered such an evil corporation. The company of Monsanto was established in 1901 by John Francis Quinney, who named the company after his wife, Olga Monsanto. And their first product was saccharin, a popular sugar substitute. But if we fast forward to the 1920s, which began the age of Monsanto's production of toxic chemicals, and the first being PCBs, a toxic chemical that also happens to be a carcinogen that was used as a coolant in electrical devices. PCBs were so toxic that they were eventually banned in 1979, but for many years Monsanto tried to keep them in the market. In 1926, they even went as far as incorporating a town in Illinois. And of course, they named that town Monsanto. You see, back in those days, the control of most environmental regulations fell on local laws. So the new town of Monsanto made it easier for the Monsanto company to build its largest PCB plants to produce more of this toxic chemical. This was their first attempt at manipulating the laws to increase their profits, something they would implement more and more in the decades that followed. Now, if we fast forward to 1939, we will see that Monsanto was becoming a key player in the chemical industry, so much so that they were involved in the Manhattan Project. This was the project that led to the creation of the atomic bomb. The bombs that would be dropped in the two cities in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And this wouldn't be their last involvement in warfare. You see, in 1962, Monsanto was also involved in the production of Agent Orange. This was a chemical they created for the US government to be used in the Vietnam War in Operation Ranch Hand. You see, the Vietnam War involved guerrilla warfare. The enemy, also known as the Viet Cong, would hide in the thick foliage of the Vietnam jungle, which made it very difficult to see the enemy, making it very dangerous for the US troops. So they called in Agent Orange, created by Monsanto. This was truly a powerful herbicide containing dioxin, a scary formula strengthened for warfare. This was sprayed all over the battlefield in efforts to kill the jungle plants, making it easier to see the enemy. Well, this war tactic came with some serious consequences. You see, when they sprayed millions of gallons of Agent Orange on the jungle, well, this toxic chemicals came into contact with civilians and soldiers from both sides. This caused widespread side effects to over 3 million people. 500,000 children to be born with serious birth defects like missing limbs and deformed faces. This chemical, called Agent Orange, also led to thousands of US soldiers to go home with diseases like lung cancers, leukemias, and many more serious diseases. Side effects made possible by the work of the Monsanto Corporation. And their terror gets worse and even more sinister. You see, they were also the creators of the insecticide DDT. This was used to fight off malaria from mosquitoes, but there was an issue that DDT was producing nasty side effects that led to liver deterioration, as well as the disruption of the central nervous system and increased risk of breast cancers. DDT was also a key factor that almost led to the bald eagle to go extinct. You see, the bald eagle, the symbol of American freedom, would feed off insects that were contaminated with DDT, and this caused their eggshells to become very frail. So when the bald eagle would come back to the nest and sit on its eggs, they would crack, an obvious problem to their survival. Well, once DDT was banned, allowed the bald eagle population to soar once again, and the terror keeps piling on. Monsanto was also the creators of the bovine growth hormone. This was a hormone that was injected into cows to produce more milk. Well, this unnatural method of forcefully producing more milk created these poor cows to suffer much pain from enlarged and swollen udders, as well as inflammation that led to pus being pumped out of the udders. Still want that glass of milk? I don't think so. Well, milk from cows injected with bovine growth hormone has been linked to breast cancer, as well as colon and prostate cancer. And there's more. One of the Monsanto's most truly evil schemes is how they harass small farmers. That's right, this massive corporation has made it a point to go after small town farmers. Why? Well, let me give you a brief rundown. So Monsanto has patented their GMO seeds, meaning any use of them without their permission is breaking the law. Well, farms across the country are oftentimes just separated by a small road. This can make GMO seeds planted in one farm to be taken up into the wind and land on another farm, and thus contaminating any organic farms with GMO seed. And Monsanto then sends its people out, and if they find any GMO seed or crops on the farms that have not purchased them, then guess what? They take these farmers to court. These small-time farmers who are trying to do things the right way get punished for seeds they didn't want there in the first place. Monsanto says it's the responsibility of the farmers to provide the buffer they need to prevent this from happening. Yet, it is their genetically modified seed that is causing the problem. Well, the big pockets of Monsanto bring these small-town farmers to court, making them have to spend all their money on court fees that leave them with little options. There have been hundreds and hundreds of farmers that have been taken to court for reasons they had very little control over. And this harassment of farmers by Monsanto is taken to a whole new sinister level overseas. You see, Monsanto has gone global, and in India, they sell their BT cotton to very poor farmers. Well, this BT cotton has caused these rural farmers to use more and more pesticides that they no longer can afford, which eventually leads to poor yields and leaves them with massive debt that they can't pay off. And since in India, any debt is forgiven when a person dies, this has led to more than 300,000 farmers committing suicide. Let me say that again, in case you missed it. Since 1995, more than 300,000 farmers have taken their own lives, some hanging themselves to be found by their families. Why? Well, to them, this is the only option they have to relieve their families of this debt. I want to be clear that farmers are not the enemy in the story. They are the victim. They are being forced to use new farming practices, leaving behind methods like seed sharing that has been done for thousands of years. Instead, they are systematically being forced to use genetically modified seeds, forcing the American public and maybe even the world to be part of their dangerous science experiment. This is the real scary story that we should be telling. So, it's time we turn to one of the leading minds to get a better understanding on the science behind how this toxic chemical is affecting us. It's time we hear from the senior researcher at MIT, Dr. Stehpanie Seneff. But first, a break to hear from our sponsors. From what we have learned so far, it is very important to have a healthy gut microbiome. You see, the trillions of bacteria in our gut will play a huge role in our overall health, and finding ways to support these good bacteria has just got a lot easier. I want to introduce you to Restore. What is Restore? What Restore does is it helps improve the biodiversity of the gut microbiome to support good immune function. Restore helps fight back against the damage that toxins like glyphosate can have on our gut's good bacteria, and the damage on gut lining that can lead to leaky gut. Well, Restore helps by strengthening the tight junctions that line the gut, giving you a better chance to avoid the effects of toxins like glyphosate. And you can head over to restoreforlife.com to get your personal bottle. And don't forget to use coupon code BURN1KS for a bonus 20% off. Again, that is BURN, B-U-R-N, the number 1, and then KS, for a bonus 20% off. And you can find the link on the show notes of this episode. Now, let's get back to the show. Well, now that we have a better understanding of what GMOs and the chemical glyphosate are, it's time to turn to the expert in this field to go deeper into the science. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Stehpanie Seneff. She is a brilliant mind and one of the heroes leading the research to discover the real dangers of glyphosate. And when it comes to the science behind glyphosate, there aren't many that have the depth of knowledge she holds. Dr. Seneff is a biophysicist with 3 degrees from MIT. Currently, she's a senior research scientist at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has published over 170 papers. Her research interests have always been in the intersection of biology and computation. You see, her knowledge of computer science has allowed her to set up systems for data analysis, to be able to comb through all the studies, to make connections that would normally be too rigorous to complete. In a way, she's a real-life Sherlock Holmes for our health, and the work of her and her colleagues is allowing us to see the real science behind toxic chemicals like glyphosate. So let's give it up for this senior researcher at MIT, Dr. Stehpanie Seneff. Dr. Seneff, your journey that led you to take a deeper look into the effects of glyphosate is very interesting. Can you give us a quick background on how you got to aiming your focus on this toxin? And how has your knowledge of computer science helped you find the links between glyphosate and its negative effects on our health?
Well, that's a big question, but we'll start with how I got here. It was really from autism, and I got worried about autism about maybe 10 years ago, looking at the exponential growth and the rates, and I knew that exponential growth is very scary. So I wanted to find out what were the environmental toxins that might be causing it. And I looked at vaccines for quite a while, and I really wasn't thinking of glyphosate at all because it's supposed to be non-toxic. Fortunately, I happened to hear a talk by Professor Don Huber, who's a retired expert on plant physiology and plant pathology from Purdue, and he scared the hell out of me because when I finished that talk, I understood that I had found my answer, and I have not looked back. That was close to 5 years ago, and I have been deep into glyphosate ever since. I'm absolutely convinced that it is the most important chemical causing autism, as well as many other diseases that are going up dramatically today in this country. So I'm obviously very worried about this chemical. I do have a computer science background, and this allows me to do some interesting things, certainly in terms of collecting data and looking at correlations, analyzing, for example, the vaccine adverse event reporting system, looking at all the statistics of trends for different vaccines. I actually am very worried about glyphosate in the vaccines, and I think that may be a contributor to the association of MMR vaccine with autism. And I also gather all kinds of research papers and do statistical analyses on those to uncover patterns that helps me to figure out the science. So the computer science background is quite useful to me.
Now that is using science and technology the right way. Now, Dr. Seneff, in many of your talks, you have shown some alarming graphs that show a sharp rise in many serious diseases like autism. This and many other diseases have also seen a sharp incline in the population, and they happen to go along the same timeline that glyphosate was introduced. Can you cover some of these diseases that have taken these sharp increases that correlates with the introduction and increasing levels of this toxic chemical that is glyphosate?
I mean, it's pretty amazing. I'm certainly starting off with autism, perfect match, 0.997 correlation coefficient between the rate of autism in first grade and the use of glyphosate on core crops over the preceding 4 years. So that would be from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life. Then there's Alzheimer's disease, very strong correlation, Parkinson's disease, various cancers such as bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, pancreatic cancer, various gastrointestinal problems, infection in the gut, and inflammatory gut, and of course we have the leaky gut problem, liver disease, kidney failure. The list goes on and on. It's really quite amazing. And they're all very strongly correlated with the glyphosate. Of course, diabetes and obesity as well, which are really big ones. They're also going up dramatically, exactly in step with the dramatic rise in the use of glyphosate on core crops.
I would say those are some frightening statistics. This seems to be happening wherever glyphosate is introduced. I've read about the study in France that showed a reduction in sperm count around 1990, which also happens to be around the same time that glyphosate was introduced. Dr. Seneff, can you help us understand what are the effects of glyphosate on the fertility of men and women, as well as the possible birth defects on children like anencephaly?
Yes, I'm absolutely convinced that glyphosate is playing a major role in infertility problems worldwide. We're seeing it in China. I mean, China has a dramatic decrease in sperm quality. U.S., Europe, Australia, all these places that have high usage of glyphosate have also this problem with the sperm. And there have been studies that have been done directly on glyphosate's effects on the testes. It definitely disrupts the production of testosterone. It disturbs these nerve cells that take care of the of the sperm cells, and it also probably disrupts the sperm's mobility. I mean, there are many different ways in which I can expect glyphosate to cause harm to the sperm, and I think it's also causing the problems with the female reproductive system. Studies on breast cancer cells have shown in vitro exposed to extremely tiny amounts of glyphosate showed that those cells were encouraged to proliferate in the presence of glyphosate. So that's going to make the tumor grow very tiny amounts, measured in parts per trillion. And so glyphosate disrupts the hormones very particularly. And of course, when you have hormone disruption, you have developmental problems. And I have written an entire paper on glyphosate and anencephaly together with Dr. Greg Nye, N-I-G-H Nye. An amazing paper actually just came out. It's now available on the web, open access, so you can download it and read the whole thing. It's quite detailed, and it shows all the different, it's called Glyphosate and Anencephaly, Death by 1,000 Cuts. And we show so many different ways in which glyphosate would disrupt the neural tube development, leading to things like anencephaly, and of course also microcephaly, which is a less drastic version. Anencephaly means no brain, and microcephaly means small brain. Both of those I suspect. It's very strong evidence also for anencephaly in the human population, particularly with an epidemic in anencephaly that showed up in Washington State, Yakima, Washington. They have had a whole extremely high rate of anencephaly over a period of time when they were using high levels of glyphosate to control weeds in the waterways in that area, the Yakima Valley. Very, very striking. So I really do believe that glyphosate is causing both birth defects and infertility.
That really is tragic. I've actually seen some of these images of these poor children born with anencephaly. They really show the dangers of this chemical. And I will make sure to place the link to your paper on the show notes. Now, I understand that glyphosate is a chelating agent. Can you explain to our listeners the chelation effects and the implications on brain diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia?
Yes, I mean, glyphosate is a very strong chelator, and that means it binds to metals and makes them unavailable. It can also transport metals to places, toxic metals to places where they should not be, and then release them there once the pH changes. Once the pH drops to an acidic pH, glyphosate will let go. So what I believe it's doing is, for example, it binds to aluminum, and that hides the aluminum's positive charge, which makes it easier for the aluminum to get past the gut barrier and also past the brain barrier. I think glyphosate is delivering aluminum to the brain region and then causing, aluminum is a very strong factor in Alzheimer's disease. Glyphosate is also binding to minerals in the gut and making them unavailable to the gut microbes, particularly manganese. And I've written a whole paper about manganese, linking it to autism. Very strong evidence autistic kids have low manganese, and manganese is important as a catalyst for certain enzymes that are disrupted in association with autism. And glyphosate binds very strongly to manganese and prevents it from being taken up even into the plants. For example, the minerals, Professor Don Huber showed in his studies that many minerals, important minerals like manganese and iron and zinc, are depleted. They don't go into the plant in the presence of glyphosate because glyphosate is binding to them, preventing them from being taken up. So it's both prevention and incorrect transport of the minerals. It messes up the whole homeostasis of the minerals in the body, actually making minerals both toxic and deficient at the same time. So manganese and iron can become toxic at the same time that the cells are not getting enough because glyphosate is distributing them in the wrong way.
Wow, that is scary. Now, in other episodes, I have mentioned how ketones are a great superfuel for the brain. Is this something that you would agree with?
Yes, I think ketones are really good, are really healthy for the brain, definitely. Just the brain needs, of course, a lot of fat. The brain does not metabolize fat, and I think one of the reasons is because fat is so important to the brain. The brain is a very fatty organ, and it needs all this fat in the myelin sheath in order to protect the neurons and keep them safe from oxidative damage and things like that. So,
fat really is the best brain food. Now, Monsanto's tried really hard to convince the public and the government agencies that glyphosate was safe. Some of the research, or should I say, bad science that was done, claimed to have no negative health implications. These were short-term rat studies. But from what I understand, another researcher named Seralini applied these rat studies, but for much longer. Dr. Seneff, can you help explain his findings? And can you express the possible long-term health effects on the population, as well as the bioaccumulation effect of glyphosate on the body?
Yes, that's a big question, but let me start with Seralini. You're absolutely right. Seralini did a study over the entire lifespan of these rats, and he did this exactly the same study protocol as what Monsanto had used, but had only looked for 3 months, and Monsanto didn't find anything wrong. Seralini also didn't find anything wrong at 3 months. Its problems did not start showing up until 4 months, but eventually those rats had, the females had massive mammary tumors, the males had kidney damage and liver damage. Both sexes were disrupted in their reproductive system, and they had suffered from an early death. So he found all kinds of problems with the glyphosate, but not until after 3 months. And that's the really scary thing about glyphosate, is that its effects are slow and insidious and cumulative. This is what really frightens me, because people are getting exposed to glyphosate all the time in their food. And I think they are slowly accumulating it throughout their tissues. And the way this is happening is through this amazing technique that glyphosate has, which I have not proven, but I'm quite sure it's true because it fits extremely well with all the data that I'm seeing on all these correlations with these diseases, which is that it gets into proteins by mistake, substituting for the coding amino acid glycine. So this is a bit of biology, but the proteins are very, very important in the body, and they are assembled according to the DNA code. And there's a code for glycine, which is one of the coding amino acids. And I think when the machinery sees that code, it can mistake glyphosate as a glycine molecule, because it actually is a complete glycine molecule. It just has extra stuff attached to the nitrogen atom. So I think this system is getting confused and putting it in there. And this is going to cause enormous disruption for certain proteins that have essential glycines in certain places. And that's where the fun comes in terms of the research, to identify all those proteins that have these very important glycine residues, and to predict what would happen if they were replaced by glyphosate. And then you find that that explains an enormous list of diseases that are correlated with glyphosate. Glyphosate disrupts the gut lining. This is one thing I'm seeing very clearly. It causes a leaky gut syndrome, which then leads to a leaky brain syndrome as well. So the barriers get leaky, which allows glyphosate to get into places it should not be. And then when it gets picked up, it gets actively taken up by cells through these amino acid transporters, because it is an amino acid, so that it's actively taken up by the cells and incorporated into their proteins. And once that happens, it's extremely difficult to get rid of it, because I believe it makes the proteins difficult to break down. So not only are they broken, they're not working in the way they should, but they also resist proteolysis, so you end up with accumulated cellular debris that you can't get rid of. And this can lead to Alzheimer's very directly, because you have, like, for example, the amyloid beta plaque associated with Alzheimer's has 2 glycine residues that have been fingered as the toxic element in that molecule. People are realizing that it's the glycines that are causing trouble. What they don't realize is that they're causing trouble because they're being replaced by glyphosate. They've been there for a very long time. They are highly conserved residues in that protein, and it makes no sense that they would suddenly become a problem at this point, but that's because it's not glycine, it's glyphosate, and it's causing the protein to misfold and to resist getting broken down, and therefore to accumulate and cause damage associated with Alzheimer's disease.
Well, it seems like the claims Monsanto made, that this toxin gets excreted from the body without causing side effects, doesn't seem to be quite accurate. Now, I have also heard the effects of glyphosate on other toxins, in that it makes them even more toxic to the body. Dr. Seneff, can you help us understand this better?
Yes, that's very clear, actually. There are studies on rats that have shown that glyphosate severely suppresses a class of enzymes called cytochrome P450 enzymes. Short name is CYP enzymes, CYP. And those enzymes are absolutely essential for detoxing a number of different other toxic chemicals. For example, the neonicotinoids, the various insecticides, the PCBs. So these things are not being properly metabolized by the liver. Acetaminophen is another one, Tylenol. Glyphosate disrupts the metabolism of Tylenol. And so all of these other toxic chemicals become much more toxic than they would otherwise be in the presence of glyphosate. And I also mentioned already about aluminum glyphosate. I believe it escorts aluminum past the gut barrier, past the brain barrier, and gets aluminum and delivers aluminum to the brain.
Now that's concerning when you consider the big problem the country has with the overconsumption of medications. Now, many out there who are first considering a low-carb ketogenic diet have the fear of cholesterol. I have covered in episode 4 the importance of cholesterol and why we need it, but from what I understand, glyphosate has effects of dysregulation of cholesterol. Can you break this down for us to understand?
Yes, and it's very interesting what I'm finding. Initially, I was focused on endothelial nitric oxide synthase called eNOS. It's a very, very important and interesting protein that's one of the things it does is it makes nitric oxide, you might imagine from its name, and that causes the vessels to relax and causes the blood to flow, so it's really good stuff. We've written papers arguing that it can also oxidize sulfur as well as nitrogen, and that it oxidizes sulfur when it's attached to the membrane, producing sulfate instead of eventually the nitric oxide becomes nitrate, so there's an oxidizing nitrogen to nitrate or oxidizing sulfur to sulfate. And this latter activity, making sulfate, is very, very important for the cells to maintain a healthy exterior. They produce the sulfated sugar chains, complicated sulfated sugar chains that they pour outside the door and keep surrounding the cell with these things that keeps the cell healthy and makes it work properly in terms of all of its metabolic activities. The sulfate is very, very important. And eNOS is a cytochrome P450 enzyme, so it is going to be disrupted by glyphosate, just like the other CYP enzymes. So my suspicion is that eNOS is getting disrupted in its ability to make sulfate and causing sulfate deficiency. And normally in the skin makes lots and lots of cholesterol sulfate, as well as, of course, vitamin D, in response to sunlight. The sulfate synthesis is catalyzed by sunlight. And so in the presence of sunlight, the skin produces vitamin D sulfate and cholesterol sulfate. And cholesterol sulfate is a super important molecule. It's a great way to transport both cholesterol and sulfate. And so when it's not being produced in adequate amounts, both cholesterol and sulfate become deficient. And that forces then an increase in the production of LDL by the liver. That's the so-called bad cholesterol. That everybody's taking a statin drug, to try to bring it down. The liver has to produce more LDL because of the inefficiencies of the cholesterol sulfate delivery system. Worse than this, I've just only recently realized that the LDL receptor itself has essential glycines that would be disrupted by glyphosate, preventing it from allowing the LDL to deliver its goods to the tissue. So the LDL particles could be accumulating simply because the receptors are broken and the cells are not able to take it up efficiently.
Well, as I have said before, cholesterol is much more complex than the simple idea of good and bad cholesterol. And it seems like actual sunlight is very important, not just for vitamin D, but as well as for maintaining good cholesterol function. So guys, make sure to spend time outside getting natural sunlight, especially in the morning.
But there's also something even more interesting about vitamin D, which is that there's a vitamin D binding protein that allows vitamin D to be taken up by the cells that are going to activate it. So, and in the kidney, furthermore, vitamin D is activated by cytochrome P450 enzymes. So not only does glyphosate disrupt, vitamin D sulfate production in the skin, catalyzed by sunlight, but glyphosate also disrupts the activation of vitamin D, both by the liver and by the kidney, because those involve cytochrome P450 enzymes in both the liver and the kidney to activate the vitamin D. And furthermore, the vitamin D binding protein uptake is also predicted to be disrupted by glyphosate if, in fact, it gets into proteins by mistake in place of glycine. So I'm finding multiple ways in which glyphosate would disrupt the body's natural system for activating vitamin D and also for producing vitamin D sulfate, so for transporting vitamin D. And therefore, we have a massive epidemic in vitamin D deficiency right now, again, in step with the rise in the use of glyphosate. And I think glyphosate is a direct hit on that epidemic.
I think it's pretty clear that natural sunlight needs to be a priority. It's more important than many realize. Now, in the low-carb community, we understand the dangers of excess sugar consumption, but the sugar we are being fed has an even darker side to it. Dr. Seneff, can you help explain to the listeners the interaction between glyphosate and sugar production, as well as its effects on obesity and diseases like type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, well, it's remarkable that all the sugars pretty much are contaminated with glyphosate. If you think about it, sugar beets are GMO Roundup ready. Sugar cane is frequently sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest as a ripener, and high fructose corn syrup comes from GMO Roundup ready corn. So all of them are going to be contaminated with glyphosate. I've done a deep dive into fructose because it's quite interesting. I've written a paper about glyphosate and ALS, that's Lou Gehrig's disease, together with colleagues. There's a long paper on ALS, really fascinating research we did, discovering again the connections with the glycine substitutions in proteins. But in that paper, we talked about how glyphosate can be predicted to disrupt fructose metabolism by the gut microbes. And fructose is actually a precursor to the pathway that glyphosate blocks that produces the aromatic amino acids. So what will happen, I would predict, is that first of all, you'll have a deficiency in those aromatic amino acids, but you'll also have excess fructose that's not getting properly processed by the gut. And as a consequence, that fructose goes to the liver. The liver has to try its best to get all of that fructose out before it hits the general circulation, because fructose is extremely dangerous as a glycating agent. It's 10 times as bad as glucose. And the liver sort of understands. I mean, it's the liver's job to clear toxins from the blood before it gets into the general circulation. And excess fructose would be viewed as a toxin. The liver's going to grab it up, and it's going to convert it into fat, and it's going to end up having to store it as a fatty liver disease, or package it up inside LDL particles and again raise your serum LDL. So either way, you're going to be in trouble. Eating sugars contaminated with glyphosate is going to be a direct path to fatty liver disease and high serum LDL.
Just another reason why low-carb keto diets that avoid sugar are a great tool to apply. Now, obesity on its own is a serious issue, and this is not only in America. Countries all over the world who are adopting a Western diet are seeing a rise in the rate of obesity. Dr. Seneff, can you help us understand the links between glyphosate and obesity?
Well, again, this is where I'm looking into this idea of glyphosate substituting for glycine, and it turns out that there's a protein called hormone-sensitive lipase, which is in the fat cells and which responds to hormonal stimulation and causes the fat cells to release their fat in order for it to be used as fuel, for example, for the muscles, as energy for the cells. And that protein has, again, essential glycine residues that if they were replaced by glyphosate would cause it not to work, which would cause the fat cells to not be able to release their fat. So what will happen is that the fat will just continue to build up inside the fat cells and won't be able to get out, and you'll get obese. So I really think it's a metabolic problem. You know, people get so criticized for being such gluttons, and it really isn't fair to them because they're compelled to store that fat in those fat cells because of that broken protein. That's what I think is happening.
Further proof that this is not all about calories in and calories out. Weight loss success has many factors. This is why many struggle. Well, I hope you're starting to see the toxic effects of this chemical and why it's a very real monster we are encountering on a daily basis. But where are we coming face to face with this toxic chemical? Dr. Seneff, can you help us understand where we encounter glyphosate? What foods or environments have shown to have the highest levels of this silent killer?
It's pretty much all over the place. I mean, certainly if you live near a farm, you're going to be exposed through the air. A study in Kentucky found, I think, something like 76% of the water samples in the rain were tested positive for glyphosate. It's all over the food supply. Now, America has been extremely irresponsible in measuring glyphosate levels in foods. We've been trying to, my activator friends, my friends who are activists have been trying to get our government to test foods for glyphosate, and they've been extremely reluctant to do that. However, organizations have tested it, and like the Organic Consumer Organization, and they have found high levels in things like Oreo cookies, Cheerios. You have non-GMO Cheerios, and they're loaded with glyphosate. In ice cream, there were a whole bunch of tests on Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and all but one of something like 13 flavors came out positive for glyphosate in the ice cream. There are extremely high levels in unexpected places like garbanzo beans and chickpeas. So that's, for example, hummus. If you like the Mediterranean food, hummus is extremely highly toxic with glyphosate. It's not because it's GMO. It's not GMO, but the beans are sprayed with glyphosate right before the harvest. And then it's in wheat. Wheat is also sprayed right before harvest. As I mentioned, all the sugars, the fructose, the sugar cane, the sugar beets, all have reasons to be highly contaminated with glyphosate. It's probably in the oils as well. Of course, the soybeans, the corn, pretty much all the food. The animal products have it too because it's going into the animal tissues. So in the chicken and in the beef, in the milk, all of these things are contaminated with glyphosate.
Well, I'm pretty sure that the inner fat kid in all of us just shed a tear. I know when I was 280 pounds, Oreos were my kryptonite. I was surprised about hummus. That is something that many think is really good for you. Well, apparently it can have high levels of this toxic chemical. Well, Dr. Seneff, learning about the effects of this toxic chemical has many of us a bit frightened. I know this is the Halloween special, but I think we discovered more than we bargained for. So, where do we go from here? What would be your plan of action to reduce the risk of exposure for our future generations? And how would one go about detoxing from any previous exposure to glyphosate?
Of course, the obvious thing that should happen is the government should simply ban it from the face of the earth. And I really wish the U.S. government would wake up and realize what's happening, because our people, our population is getting very sick, and it's going to reach a crisis level, I think, quite soon. There are things you can do as an individual, and that is very fortunate that we have a certified organic label. It's not perfect, and it's not going to be necessarily glyphosate free, but generally the organic foods test with considerably lower levels than the non-organic food. So you're really encouraged to buy certified organic food, and fortunately that is becoming more and more available. If you don't live near places like Whole Foods, you can actually order certified organic foods on the web as well. And of course, Whole Foods just got bought out by Amazon, so that's going to make the prices go down, and that's going to make it also more accessible through internet. Just ordering it online. In terms of detoxing, one thing I strongly recommend is Bragg's organic apple cider vinegar. A very useful product. We try to eat it every day. It has a microbe in it called Acinetobacter that can actually metabolize glyphosate fully, and there are very few microbes that can do this. So this is what I think makes this vinegar extremely attractive. In general, eating probiotics is good because your gut microbes are severely disrupted by glyphosate, and you can help to heal the gut by renewing those microbes by eating things like yogurt and kefir and sauerkraut and sour cream and all of these fermented foods. And then there's also, people recommend organic matter from the soil, fulvic acid and humic acid, as well as bentonite clay. These are things that can help to bind to glyphosate and take it out through the feces. So people have found some success with those products to help reduce the glyphosate load.
Ah yes, we do now have better options to go for. Dr. Seneff, I am a big fan of your work, and I, as well as my listeners, want to thank you for all the hard work you do to research this very important issue that needs to be addressed. I want to also applaud you for the courage to tell the world about this serious issue. We are all that much more informed because of your willingness to educate us. Now, is there any closing thoughts that you want to share with us?
I really would like to get anybody who is listening to this and who believes what I am saying to get on board, to help to tell their friends and their family, do whatever they can, whatever skills they have to work towards, ideally towards solutions, growing organic food, encouraging other people, making people aware of how they might be able to repair the autism. I mean, this message needs to get out. So advocacy, of course, anyone who has the stomach for it, to go after the government, because the government ought to be changing the laws, and they're being very uncooperative. So I think, and of course, lawsuits against Monsanto, I mean, whatever anybody can think of to try to fight back, we need to do this. We need to do this now and aggressively if we're going to have a future for this country, I believe. So I would just encourage everybody listening to take action in whatever way they can.
Yes, that is something I have made sure to be clear about, that we need to act now, before it's too late. Dr. Seneff, I'm sure there are listeners that would love to learn more about your work. Where could they go to do this?
One thing, if you can remember my last name, Seneff, it's fairly rare, so I think if you type that into a search engine, you'll find lots of stuff. I've done many interviews and slideshows, and I have various papers and essays, so there's a lot of material on the web. You can go to my website, which is at MIT, http:// //people, PEOPLE .CSAIL, Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL.MIT.edu/SENEFF, my last name. There I have a lot of material posted, and most of my recent papers that I've written on glyphosate and published in the research journals, and various slide decks, various slideshows that I've given, various talks. So there's a lot of material on my webpage.
Dr. Seneff, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to have you back again on the Burn It Nutrition podcast.
That would be great. Thank you for doing this.
Well, I know this was a lot of information to process, and hey, you can always go back and listen to this episode again. That is, if you're not too scared. Well, this episode was by far the toughest to produce, but this topic is probably one of the most important we have covered on the Burn It Nutrition podcast. You see, the more we understand the effects of using toxins like glyphosate, the more we can find ways to avoid them, or at least help spread the message in hopes of bringing much-needed changes to how our food is produced. You know, it still boggles my mind to realize that a powerful chemical company now decides what is healthy and what is used to grow our food. This just doesn't feel right. Why is it that toxic chemicals go hand in hand with our food supply? I know that many supporters of GMOs claim that we need them to feed our growing populations. They say that in order to feed the billions of people, we need to use biotechnology to modify the crops to give us enough yields to feed the world. But is this accurate? Well, not really. You see, out of all the huge amounts of GMO crops that are produced each year, very little goes to feeding poor and starving third world countries. But in reality, the vast amounts of GMOs actually go to make the cheap and highly processed junk food sold all over the USA. That's right, GMOs are used to make the junk food at fast food restaurants. They use GMO corn to make high fructose corn syrup that goes into sodas and ketchup. They use GMO corn to feed the animals that will be killed to produce the meat for burger patties. They use GMO canola to make highly refined vegetable oils to fry the potatoes that were sprayed with glyphosate as a desiccant right before harvest. And this combo of high-carb diets on top of processed meats, on top of highly inflammatory vegetable oils, on top of the use of toxic chemicals like glyphosate to grow it, is why we are so sick and rapidly growing to be one of the fattest and sickest countries in the world. If this doesn't make you angry, then I don't know what will. Again, GMOs are not the answer to feeding the world, at least not in a healthy and sustainable way. The problem isn't that we don't have enough food. The real issue is food distribution. Yes, we have the food to feed the world, but the issue is getting it to the areas that need it. Plus, in the US, food waste is another big issue. Remember that for thousands of years, humans grew crops without the need for pesticides or herbicides. We didn't need to play God and create frankenseeds in the lab. We didn't need to trick nature. We learned to work with nature. We understood the importance of keeping a healthy soil. But the practice of spraying the soil and crops with toxic chemicals like glyphosate that are chelating agents that stay in the soil trapping key minerals is not helping. This is the very real monster our generation is facing. So, how are we going to respond to it? You see, throughout history, all generations had to fight a monster of some kind. Each era had their villain, their Goliath. In the 1940s, it was Hitler's German war machine that was trying to destroy the world. This made nations come together to fight for the future of humanity. Well, it seems like we also have our own battle, but this battle is going on without many even being aware of it. You see, there is a fight going on to get the companies using GMO products to begin to place labels, letting us, the consumer, know what we are eating. This is clearly something that needs to be done. It is not brain science. We should be demanding labeling of products that contain GMOs. But of course, the big companies like Monsanto don't want this for obvious reasons. They understand that more people are becoming aware of the dangers of GMOs. They don't want mothers to see a box of cereals that they're buying for their kids to have GMO labels. Why? Well, because most moms wouldn't buy it. And so they know it will hurt their profits. But hey, that is their problem, not ours. We shouldn't be forced to consume toxic chemicals without our knowledge. You see other companies make it a point to brand their products. For example, Nike, Apple, Mercedes. These are all brands that take pride in their products, and you can clearly see the brand. You know that you're buying an Apple iPhone or a laptop. Why? Well, because their little bitten apple is on their products. They even give you Apple stickers to put on your cars. But not Monsanto. They don't want you to know that most of the processed foods all around you contain their genetically modified frankenfoods. But this scary story has not reached the final chapter. And well, you are the one who decides how this story will end. How? Well, either you will finish hearing this episode and continue on with your life as if this doesn't pertain to you, as if this monster will not reach you, or you will see the very real battle that is happening around you, and you will choose to take action. The choice is yours. And well, just so you know, people all over the world are taking action and coming together to fight back. And now countries all over the world have began to ban GMOs. Countries like France, Italy, Greece, Germany, Norway, Switzerland, Peru, Ecuador, even Russia and Saudi Arabia, they have all banned the cultivation of GMOs. But not the US. No. On the contrary, a lot of our federal agencies have made it easier for the large corporations like Monsanto to spread their reign of destruction. But there seems to be some sign of hope. In 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer said that glyphosate, the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, is probably carcinogenic to humans. This classification sparked over 800 people who had developed certain cancers like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to file a lawsuit against Monsanto. This agency had looked at human and animal studies, and they concluded that after examining the evidence, it appeared that there was a likely link between glyphosate and these types of cancers. And just recently, in July of 2017, the state of California's Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment moved forward to place glyphosate on the list of chemicals known to cause cancer. Meaning any products in California that contain glyphosate will have to eventually place warning signs on these products. This did not make Monsanto very happy, of course, and they sued this California agency trying to stop this. But so far, they have not been able to, and the listing has been upheld by the California Supreme Court. 2 points for the good guys. Now, California is leading the way and have shown to put priority into the health of its citizens. So, like Dr. Stehpanie Seneff said, maybe it's time to reach out to your local state officials and demand for labeling of this toxic chemical. It will not be easy, but coming together as a group can make it happen. This is what Italians did back in 2007. Over 3 million Italians signed a petition demanding that GMOs be banned from their country. And well, now they are banned in all of Italy. So what are we gonna do? Are we gonna let this continue? Remember, the choice is ours. We have a voice. It just takes action for it to be heard. And one of the biggest weapons we now have to fight back with is the ability to share this message with the world. Now we have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these social platforms that allow us to be part of the movement for change. So do your part and share this information with at least 3 other people. Hopefully, it will be the spark that triggers change, and you can be a part of it. So get on your phones and share this with at least 3 other people. Send it now and be part of the generation that changed the fate of a nation. We have come to the end of part 1 of this series and the end of the Halloween-themed episode of the Burn It Nutrition Podcast. My goal with this episode was to help share the message on the importance of bringing awareness to the dangers that can come from saturating our food supply with toxic chemicals like glyphosate. I want to close with this quote from Dr. Don Huber. He was a longtime professor at Purdue University and an expert in plant pathology, and he said, "When future historians write about our time, they are not going to write about the tons of chemicals that we did or didn't apply. When it comes to glyphosate, they are going to write about our willingness to sacrifice our children and jeopardize our existence, while threatening and jeopardizing the very basis of our existence, the stability of our agriculture." Guys, that's what we're fighting for the ability to leave our children a world full of beauty and resources, to leave them the thriving planet we and our grandparents got to experience. But unless we act now, this may not happen. Now, did this episode scare you? Did you leave the light on? Oh, I'm sure you did. Well, that's okay. This truly was a scary story, especially because this story is true. This episode was the most challenging to produce, and I hope the long hours it took me to create it is helping you see why it's a very real problem. Which brings us to the review of the week, and this one is from Rebel Z, and he gave a 5-star review. Boom, thank you, sir. And he wrote, "New subscriber. This podcast is presented in an interesting format that is both relaxing and informative. I look forward to listening to all the episodes and future ones on the horizon. I appreciate all the work that Joseph puts into this to get this message out there." Thank you very much for that. I truly appreciate your feedback. So, if you like this show and found it useful, then hey, leave me a quick rating and review on iTunes. Simply search for the Burn It Nutrition podcast and leave me your thoughts, and you may even hear it on there. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Facebook under Burn It Nutrition. Plus, don't forget to check out the show notes of this episode to find any links of the items we mentioned. Now, before I end this episode, that went longer than I expected, let's remember what we heard today, both from the history to the science presented by Dr. Stehpanie Seneff. You know, being real, everything I read and researched for this episode really frustrated me. Yes, each episode takes a lot of work, but it's work that I enjoy. I love learning the science. I love diving into a topic and discovering how things work within the body. It's fascinating. But this particular episode was different. Learning about the topic of the damage of GMOs and the greed of corporate America made it very difficult to enjoy. It was disturbing, but again, the bright side, the silver lining in the story is that it's not over. What are you going to do about this today? The ball is now in your court. What are you going to do with it? So, in part 2 of this series, we will dive into the importance of gut health and finding ways to fight back against the damage on our gut health from the toxic chemicals like glyphosate. Until then, I hope you're back next time. And don't worry, you don't need to be afraid anymore. Remember that together, we are stronger than any monster. Now brace yourself, because it's time to let it burn.